Black people have often been written out of history, their contributions erased or buried beneath layers of bias, colonization, and silence. Whether in the courts of Europe, the temples of Asia, or the cities of the Americas, their presence has been downplayed, if acknowledged at all. So it's no surprise if you've never heard of a black man in ancient China. But the truth is, they were there. Long before modern borders and race-based hierarchies, black men and women stood at the crossroads of civilizations, shaping cultures far beyond the African continent. China was no exception. The story you're about to hear isn't a myth. It's a history hidden in plain sight, etched into temple walls, preserved in ancient texts, and even written into the very DNA of a nation. From early emperors with woolly hair to the martial artists of Shaolin, from pyramids in Xi'an to royal courts along the Yangtze, Africa's fingerprints stretch deep into the roots of Chinese civilization. We were there, not just as laborers or visitors, but as founders, fighters, teachers, and kings. This is a story of presence, not absence, of influence, not invisibility, of black excellence, where few thought to look. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Long before China became a unified empire under dynasties like the Han or Tang, its early civilizations along the southern coast and deep in the Yunnan highlands documented encounters with a mysterious group of dark-skinned people. They were called the Kunlun, a name whispered through Chinese folklore, ancient poetry, and historical texts. Described as strong, curly-haired, and dark like lacquer, the Kunlun people have remained a curious footnote in Chinese scholarship. But to those willing to read between the lines, they represent something far deeper: the visible traces of black African presence in ancient Asia. The Kunlun were not just one people, but a broad reference to populations of African descent who came to China by land and sea. Some accounts mention them as mystics or healers, others as soldiers or sailors. In some tales, they were feared, powerful outsiders who could command nature or see beyond the veil. In others, they were deeply respected for their wisdom and martial prowess. In Tang Dynasty records, especially during China's golden age of trade along the Silk Road, 7th to 10th centuries, the Kunlun appear frequently in art and literature. They were often depicted in paintings and carvings with distinct African features: broad noses, full lips, and tightly coiled hair. Far from being portrayed as subjugated, they are shown as dignified, sometimes divine. One famed story, Kunlun Nu, centers around a black warrior who sacrifices himself for love and loyalty, a tale that made its way into early Chinese theater and poetry. Their presence wasn't isolated to coastal cities. Imperial courts recorded black ambassadors, soldiers, and advisors, especially from regions like East Africa, where maritime trade networks connected China to places like Mogadishu, Zanzibar, and Madagascar. The ancient maritime routes were not merely commercial pathways. They were arteries of cultural exchange, carrying philosophies, technologies, and people across continents. The fact that these figures were recorded in such revered cultural works, even if later marginalized or reinterpreted, points to their significance in ancient Chinese society. Yet modern textbooks have all but erased them, reducing this complex and long-standing presence to myth, misunderstanding, or omission. So, who were the Kunlun? Were they simply African sailors who found themselves in foreign lands? Or were they part of a larger story of migration, settlement, and influence that speaks to Africa's true global reach in antiquity? As we journey further into the ruins, genes, and legends of early China, one thing becomes clear: black people were not strangers in this land. They were part of its very foundation. In 1998, a groundbreaking study conducted by the Chinese Human Genome Diversity Project in collaboration with the University of Texas quietly shook the foundations of East Asian identity. Published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the study revealed a stunning fact. The genetic origins of modern Chinese populations, nearly 1/5 of the world's people, trace back to Africa. But this wasn't headline news. It was buried in academic journals, sidestepped in school curriculums, and dismissed by those uncomfortable with the implications. The study found that Chinese people, like all modern humans, carry markers from the out-of-Africa migration, a wave of ancient travelers who walked out of the African continent around 60,000 years ago and eventually settled across the world. But what's even more striking is that some of these markers, particularly Y-DNA haplogroups like DE and its derivatives, are found in both African and East Asian populations, suggesting more recent connections beyond the original migration. Geneticist Li Jin, one of the study's lead researchers, explained that many Chinese people carry DNA that links them directly to populations in East Africa. Haplogroup D, for example, is found in Tibetans and the Ainu of Japan, and its closest relatives are found among groups in West Africa. This kind of evidence doesn't just reinforce the out-of-Africa theory, it suggests complex waves of African migration and integration across Asia that continued long after the initial human dispersal. Mitochondrial DNA, which traces maternal lineage, tells a similar story. One of the oldest mitochondrial haplogroups, M, is found in both African and Asian populations, including among Chinese ethnic minorities. This hints at shared ancestry and possibly shared civilization building in prehistoric times. The ancient African presence in East Asia is not a theory, it's in the blood, literally. Yet despite this genetic trail, mainstream history has often sidelined or sanitized Africa's role in shaping the early populations of Asia. The default narrative leans toward isolation, that China's history developed independently, untouched by African influence. But genetics tells us otherwise. People moved, cultures met, civilizations cross-pollinated. And still, one question remains. If the genes are there, if the ancestry is shared, why is the African legacy in China so hidden? The answer lies in centuries of cultural rewriting, colonization, and the persistent global devaluation of African contributions to world history. But no matter how much is buried, DNA remembers. It carries the truth of ancient footsteps across deserts, mountains, and oceans. Science doesn't lie, it whispers the stories that empires tried to erase. And in China, the genes of its people still carry the rhythm of the motherland. Long before the glory of the Han or the might of the Qin, there was the Shang, China's first historically confirmed dynasty. The Shang ruled from around 1600 to 1046 BCE. They unified early Chinese society, advanced bronze casting, developed writing, and laid the foundation for Chinese civilization. But hidden beneath the polished bronze vessels and oracle bones lies a startling possibility that the Shang were of African origin. According to historians like Dr. Runoko Rashidi and Dr. Ivan van Sertima, early Chinese texts and artwork refer to a people called the Naqi, a term meaning black people or black men. The Shang rulers were known as the Naqi, and the characters used to describe them include radicals meaning black and man. These weren't metaphors. These were descriptions of rulers with visibly African features: woolly hair, broad noses, dark skin. The Shang Dynasty's founder, Tang of Shang, is sometimes connected in folklore to distant lands, described as a foreign conqueror with celestial power. Some versions of his lineage trace his ancestry to the Western lands, suggesting a migration or royal connection from outside of China, perhaps even Africa. This isn't fringe speculation. Classical Chinese texts, like the Shiji by Sima Qian, mention encounters with dark-skinned people in the south and southwest regions of ancient China, particularly in Yunnan and along the coastal provinces. These were not enslaved peoples. They were rulers, scholars, warriors. In fact, in ancient Chinese folklore, Emperor Fu Xi, regarded as the bringer of civilization, inventor of government, writing, and the I Ching, Book of Changes, is often depicted with tightly curled hair, a broad nose, and distinctly African features. The famed historian Cheikh Anta Diop also cited the Shang Dynasty as one of the early black royal houses outside of Africa. He noted linguistic, artistic, and cultural parallels between the Shang and ancient Nubian societies. In both civilizations, there was ancestor worship, complex bronze metallurgy, pyramidal burial practices, and use of symbolic writing systems, all pointing to a potential shared root or long-standing exchange. Then, there's the evidence in stone, or more precisely in earth and clay. Outside Xi'an, near the famous Terracotta Army, lie nearly 100 pyramidal mounds, some eroded, others still sealed. These earth mounds bear a striking resemblance to Nubian burial pyramids. Unlike the towering limestone wonders of Egypt, Nubian pyramids and these Chinese tombs share steep inclines and flat tops, a design that some believe migrated eastward with early African settlers. Some black scholars even draw parallels between these royal tombs and the funerary practices of West African kingdoms like Mali and Songhai, where elite burials included warriors, horses, and spiritual totems, themes also found in the Terracotta Army. Even the Shaolin temples, home to China's most legendary martial monks, tell part of this story. In some of the oldest halls, paintings and carvings depict dark-skinned monks training alongside Han Chinese. Martial arts historians trace the roots of Shaolin fighting styles to ancient Indian and African disciplines, passed through spiritual teachers who journeyed across Asia long before Buddhism became mainstream. So what does this mean? That the image of ancient China as a homogeneous, isolated culture is a historical illusion. From the Shang to Shaolin, from pyramids to philosophy, Africa's fingerprint is there, not just at the margins, but at the center. It challenges us to ask, what else have we been taught to forget? Fast forward nearly a millennium from the Shang Dynasty, and we arrive at the golden age of Chinese civilization, the Tang Dynasty, which reigned from 618 to 907 CE. This was a time of international trade, booming cities, and global curiosity. The Silk Road connected China to Africa, the Middle East, and Europe, bringing with it not just spices and silks, but people. Among these people were the Kunlun, Africans whose presence in Chinese ports, palaces, and popular stories was both real and respected. In ancient Chinese texts, the term Kunlun was used to describe dark-skinned foreigners who arrived in China's southern ports. These individuals were often portrayed with curly hair, broad features, and strong physiques. Far from being anonymous wanderers, the Kunlun were celebrated in literature and art. Some were depicted as skilled warriors, monks, or wise men with supernatural strength or deep spiritual insight. They were also sometimes associated with seafaring, herbal medicine, and even mystical powers, echoes of how Africans were similarly seen in parts of India and Arabia. One of the most famous tales from Tang-era literature is the story of Kunlun Nu, the Kunlun slave. But don't let the title fool you. In this tale, the Kunlun man is not a background character. He's the hero, a powerful warrior who defends his master's honor, saves a kidnapped princess, and is admired for his speed and strength. He's a man of action, loyalty, and intelligence, a black figure celebrated in classical Chinese folklore. And the term slave during the Tang period didn't always carry the same connotation as the transatlantic slavery system. In many contexts, it meant a servant, bondman, or retainer, sometimes in positions of great trust and influence. Some Kunlun were bodyguards. Some were soldiers. Some served in elite imperial units. There are records of African-descended people acting as interpreters, traders, or even royal concubines within the Tang court. Chinese art from this period captures this multicultural reality. In murals, ceramics, and bronze sculptures, figures with African features appear, not caricatured but human, dignified, and adorned. In the bustling city of Guangzhou, then known as Canton, a cosmopolitan trading port, Africans walked the markets and dockyards alongside Persians, Arabs, and Southeast Asians. It was one of the first truly global cities, and black people were part of its lifeblood. Some scholars argue that this African presence was more than passing. They believe these interactions gave rise to settled communities of Africans in China, small enclaves that blended into local society over generations. The evidence is sparse, but there are reports in classical texts of black kingdoms in the southwest, particularly in what is today Yunnan province. Ancient DNA evidence also supports the idea of diverse ancestry in southern Chinese populations, particularly from regions that link back to Southeast Asia, India, and East Africa. The scholar and explorer Dr. Runoko Rashidi spent years traveling across China, documenting African-looking figures in museum collections, ancient paintings, and temple carvings. He argued that while China's historians often downplayed the African presence, the evidence was hiding in plain sight. His work, alongside that of Dr. Ivan van Sertima, challenges the image of China as an isolated, racially homogeneous empire. If Africa was present in ancient China, in its cities, courts, and cultural memory, what else has been erased? Who else shaped the foundations of global history, only to be written out in favor of more palatable narratives? The story of the Kunlun is not a side note. It's a chapter of shared human history, where blackness was visible, valuable, and vital. China is not a land often associated with pyramids, but scattered across the central province of Shanxi, particularly near the ancient capital of Xi'an, stand mysterious earth mounds, some nearly rivaling Egypt's pyramids in scale. Over 100 of these ancient structures dot the landscape, many of them officially unexplored, sealed off by trees and government silence. Chinese authorities claim they are imperial tombs, and indeed they may be. But the striking architectural parallels have raised questions among researchers, especially those attuned to African architecture and ancient engineering. Who built them? And why do some of them face cardinal directions, just like the pyramids of Kemet? While mainstream archaeology offers cautious interpretations, Afrocentric scholars like Dr. Clyde Winters and Dr. Runoko Rashidi suggest that these structures may point to an ancient African presence or influence in the formation of early Chinese civilization. It's not a claim made lightly. The idea is not that Egyptians sailed to China to build pyramids, but rather that the architectural language of sacred geometry, a knowledge deeply developed in Africa, may have traveled with migrating or trading black populations into East Asia. This theory isn't built on pyramids alone. Look to the very foundations of Chinese culture: philosophy, martial arts, cosmology, and you begin to see threads that reach far beyond Asia. One of the oldest and most revered texts in Chinese culture is the I Ching, or the Book of Changes. Credited to the mythic emperor Fu Shi, it is a system of divination, philosophy, and moral order. But Fu Chi himself, according to many depictions, is described as having woolly hair and a dark complexion. He is one of several early emperors and sages described in ways that resemble African features. Coincidence? The I Ching's symbolic use of trigrams, cycles, and elemental balance has parallels in African spiritual systems, from the Yoruba Ifa divination to Comitian numerology. The idea that these systems developed entirely in isolation is increasingly challenged by genetic, linguistic, and cultural overlaps. Even Chinese martial arts, suckers long seen as a distinctly East Asian tradition, carry whispers of African influence. The Shaolin Monastery, renowned for birthing disciplines like Kung Fu and Qigong, holds artwork that depicts dark-skinned monks alongside Han practitioners. According to some accounts, early Shaolin monks trained under or with Indian and possibly Nubian or Kushite martial artists who brought spiritual combat systems eastward via the Silk Road. The legend of Bodhidharma, the South Asian monk who brought Zen Buddhism and martial discipline to Shaolin, is also telling. Some oral traditions and artworks depict him as having darker skin and curly hair. Could he too have been of African origin, or at least influenced by African systems? All across Asia, from Cambodia to Japan, from India to Korea, there are echoes of Black presence in African thought, not as conquerors but as seeders of culture, carriers of ancient knowledge. Their influence wasn't always dominant, but it was real and long-lasting. This is not to claim ownership of Chinese civilization for Africans. That would be another kind of erasure. Instead, it is to expand the story, to acknowledge that history is richer, more layered, and more beautifully interconnected than we were ever taught. So when you see pyramids in Xi'an, don't just see tombs. See the possibility of shared genius. When you hear the I Ching, hear the rhythms of African cosmology. And when you watch a Shaolin monk move with grace and precision, imagine the footprints of ancient African teachers walking alongside him. History didn't happen in silos. It moved like rivers, crossed oceans, and touched shores the textbooks forgot. The story of Black presence in ancient China is more than historical trivia. It is a mirror that reflects a truth too long buried beneath the sands of time, the weight of colonial narratives, and the silences of institutional education. We now know that Black people, Africans, were present in the courts and countryside of ancient China. Not as slaves, not as mere curiosities, but as sages, warriors, spiritual leaders, and kings. They influenced dynasties, inspired myths, and left echoes in everything from philosophy to martial arts. What we see in ancient scrolls, DNA studies, and forgotten folklore is not just proof of presence, it is proof of power. Black intellect, Black movement. It challenges the lie of isolation and reclaims the global scale of Black brilliance. When we acknowledge the African roots intertwined in Chinese civilization, we are not erasing anyone. We are expanding the truth. And in doing so, we honor those whose legacies were erased not by time, but by design. This isn't just about the past. It's about what the future can hold when we truly know who we are. Our ancestors crossed deserts and oceans, so today we must cross mental borders. Because to remember is to reclaim, and to reclaim is to rise. This is our story too. It always has been, now we tell it, and the world listens.